My husband begged for an open marriage, and now he wants to close it because I'm dating someone else. I never imagined my life would turn into this. I'm 35, a stay-at-home wife, and I've been married to Brian, who's 39, for 7 years. We'd always planned for me to stay home while we tried for kids, and I thought we were happy. But a few months ago, Brian completely blindsided me. He said he wanted to have a serious talk, and I thought maybe it was about starting a family. Instead, he told me he wanted to open our marriage. He framed it as a way to explore and grow, but I felt like the ground beneath me crumbled. I told him I wasn't comfortable with it, but he kept pushing. He said things like, "You're being too traditional, and this is how healthy modern relationships work." When I didn't agree right away, he escalated. He said maybe I was too dependent on him and even mentioned divorce. I felt trapped. I had no job, no savings, and nowhere to go. I gave in because I didn't feel like I had a choice. Not even a week after our agreement, Brian started going out more. He put extra effort into his appearance, bought new clothes, and was always on his phone. I tried to convince myself that I could handle this, but I felt sick every time I saw him smiling at his screen. I eventually found out he was pursuing a younger coworker, Lily, who's 27. They'd been messaging a lot, and Brian even took her out on a couple of dates. I overheard him talking to her on the phone, laughing like I hadn't heard him laugh with me in years. It broke me, but I stayed quiet. I didn't want to come across as bitter. Lily, however, wasn't as on board with this arrangement as Brian thought. On their second date, he decided to come clean and tell her about the open marriage. She didn't take it well. She told him she wasn't comfortable dating a married man, even if it was allowed, and she ended things. Brian came home that night frustrated and short-tempered, but he didn't tell me why. Meanwhile, I was sinking further into despair. I felt so disconnected from my own life. I'd given everything to this marriage, my time, my energy, my dreams of building a family, and now it felt like none of it mattered. I kept thinking, why is he allowed to be happy while I'm miserable? My best friend Hannah eventually snapped me out of it. She told me I couldn't just sit at home and let him have all the control. At first, I resisted the idea of dating. It felt wrong, like I was betraying my vows, even though he'd already shattered them. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Why was I playing the martyr? Hannah set me up with James, a friend of her brother's. He's 32, a couple of years younger than me, and honestly, gorgeous. I didn't expect much going into the date, but he surprised me. He was sweet, respectful, and genuinely interested in me. For the first time in months, I felt like a person instead of just Brian's wife. We've gone out a few more times, and I'm starting to feel like I'm waking up from a long nightmare. James treats me in a way I haven't been treated in years. He listens, he's thoughtful, and he makes me feel attractive and valued. I'm not rushing into anything, but it's nice to feel like I matter again. Brian, of course, noticed. He started asking more questions about where I was going and who I was with. One night, he confronted me outright and said he didn't think this open marriage thing was working. He admitted it was messing with his head and said we should close the relationship and go back to how things were. The irony is infuriating. He was fine with the arrangement when he was chasing Lily, but now that I've found someone, he suddenly wants to change the rules. I told him I'd think about it, but the truth is, I don't know if I can go back to the way things were. I feel like he broke something in our marriage that can't be repaired. Part of me still loves him, but another part of me wonders if I was just clinging to an idea of him that no longer exists. I've spent so long sacrificing my happiness to make this marriage work, and I don't know if I want to keep doing that. So now I'm stuck. Do I try to save what's left of my marriage, or do I keep exploring this new version of myself? I feel torn, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I have options. Update. Things have been tense ever since Brian suggested closing the marriage again. When I told him I didn't think it was a good idea, he didn't take it well. He tried to guilt me, saying I was choosing some fling over our years of commitment, but I didn't cave. I told him that he was the one who wanted this arrangement, and now I was just trying to navigate it in a way that felt fair. Since then, our relationship has felt like a Cold War. He's been distant, and when he does talk to me, it's either overly sweet and apologetic or passive-aggressive. It's exhausting. He's tried to win me back by making grand gestures, flowers, surprise dinner plans, but it all feels hollow. I can't forget how quick he was to push for the open marriage in the first place. What really stung, though, was when he started dating someone new. He met her at a bar, and she's, of course, much younger. Her name is Megan, and she's 23. I know because he made sure to tell me. He said something like, "You're not the only one who can find someone new." It was obvious he was trying to make me jealous. At first, I ignored it. Let him do whatever he needs to feel better about himself. But then Megan started coming around. Brian invited her over to the house, our house, and I could feel the shift in power. It was like he was trying to reclaim control by flaunting this girl in front of me. I could tell Megan enjoyed it, too. The breaking point came when Brian invited her over for dinner one night. I didn't want her there, but I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing it bothered me. I stayed polite, trying to keep the peace. Megan, on the other hand, had no problem pushing boundaries. At one point, she turned to me and said, "Wow, you're really lucky Brian's still into older women. Most guys his age don't go for that." I froze. The audacity of her to say something like that in my own home left me speechless. Brian just sat there awkwardly, pretending he didn't hear. That moment snapped something inside me. I stood up, looked at both of them, and said, "You can have the house. I'm done." I packed a bag that night and went to stay with my parents. It was humiliating at first, showing up at their door and explaining everything. But they were kind and understanding, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't have to walk on eggshells anymore. James has been a constant through all of this. He's never pressured me for more, never tried to take advantage of the situation. He's just been there, checking in, offering support, and making me laugh when I felt like crying. We haven't defined anything between us yet, and honestly, I'm okay with that. For now, it's enough to have someone who treats me with kindness. Brian, on the other hand, hasn't taken the separation well. He's been texting and calling non-stop, alternating between apologizing and blaming me for giving up on us. He even showed up at my parents' house once, but my dad shut that down quickly. I don't know if he's still seeing Megan, and honestly, I don't care. She can deal with his drama now. As for me, I'm finally starting to see a future that doesn't involve walking on eggshells or sacrificing my happiness to make someone else feel secure. I'm taking it day by day, but for the first time in years, I feel free. Update 2. After leaving Brian and moving back in with my parents, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The days were still hard, I was mourning the life I thought I'd have, but the constant support from my family and James made it bearable. James reminded me that I didn't need to rush into anything and encouraged me to focus on myself first. That's when I decided I needed to rebuild my life, starting with finding a job. I hadn't worked in years, and my confidence was shaky, but my mom helped me polish my resume. I eventually landed a receptionist position at a small but busy medical office. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: independence. Earning my own paycheck and interacting with people outside of my personal drama was empowering. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. Meanwhile, Brian's attempts to reconcile became increasingly desperate. He called and texted constantly, alternating between begging me to come back and accusing me of being the one who destroyed our marriage. When I didn't respond, he started sending petty messages about how happy he was with Megan. I didn't bite. I knew better by then. Things escalated when Brian sent me a message saying, "If you don't come back, don't expect a dime in the divorce." It was clear he was gearing up for a fight. At first, I felt panicked. I didn't have the resources to deal with a messy legal battle. But James and my dad reminded me that I didn't have to go through it alone. I found a lawyer who came highly recommended. She was sharp, experienced, and didn't take any nonsense. She assured me that Brian couldn't just cut me off financially, especially since I'd been a stay-at-home wife at his insistence. She also advised me to start gathering any financial records or evidence that might be relevant to the case. During the discovery process, my lawyer uncovered something interesting. Brian had been spending marital funds on his dates with Megan, and not just on dinners and drinks. There were receipts for expensive gifts and even a weekend getaway. My lawyer told me this was a big deal and could work in my favor during the settlement. Brian's reckless spending was about to backfire. When Brian found out that I had a lawyer and that his financial indiscretions were coming to light, he panicked. He tried calling me, saying, "Do we really need lawyers? Can't we just settle this ourselves?" I refused. I told him, calmly but firmly, that he'd made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. Megan, it turns out, wasn't thrilled about being dragged into the drama. When she found out Brian was fighting me over money and that he'd been using joint funds to impress her, she dumped him. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she called him pathetic and told him to grow up. I couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice. In the end, the divorce settlement went in my favor. I got a fair share of our assets, including the house, which I planned to sell so I could start fresh. Brian was left with his reputation in tatters and a bitter realization that his attempts to manipulate me had only hurt him in the end. As for me, I'm in a much better place now. My job is going well, and I feel capable and confident in a way I haven't in years. James is still in my life, quietly supportive and understanding. We've started spending more time together, but we're taking things slow. For now, it's enough to have someone who truly respects me. Looking back, I realize Brian's actions broke me, but they also forced me to rebuild. And in doing so, I became someone stronger, someone who refuses to settle for less than she deserves.
She cheated with my brother, then tried to come back. Big mistake. When I first found out about the betrayal, it didn't feel real. My girlfriend Jenna, the person I had trusted with everything, had been sneaking around with my brother. We had been together for 3 years, and I had thought we were planning a future together. I met her at a mutual friend's party. She was magnetic, the kind of person who could walk into a room and instantly command attention without even trying. We hit it off that night, bonding over shared interests and an easy sense of humor. She made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced before, especially coming from a family that had always overshadowed me with my brother's achievements. For years, she was my rock, someone who made me believe I could step out from that shadow. My brother, on the other hand, had always been the golden child. From the time we were kids, he was the one who won every award, aced every exam, and charmed every adult he met. I remember one Christmas when I proudly showed off a model airplane I built, only for my parents to gush over the expensive drone he brought home from college. It was always like that. His accomplishments weren't just celebrated. They were weaponized to remind me of my supposed shortcomings. When he got his first big promotion, my parents threw him a lavish dinner and spent the entire evening talking about his bright future. When I got my first job, they barely acknowledged it. The dynamic didn't change as we got older. Even in small ways, he always found a way to outshine me. At family gatherings, he had an effortless way of charming everyone in the room, while I felt like I was struggling to keep up. It wasn't just his achievements that set him apart. It was the way my parents put him on a pedestal. They would excuse his mistakes, praise his every move, and compare me to him in ways that left no doubt about who they thought was better. She had always been charming and confident, someone who fit in seamlessly at family gatherings, which is probably how the connection with my brother started. Looking back, I can see the moments I missed, the shared glances, the way she seemed to laugh a little too hard at his jokes. I thought she was just being friendly, trying to navigate the complicated dynamics of my family. I never imagined there was something deeper happening behind my back. It was at a family event, one of those gatherings meant to celebrate my brother's birthday. I walked into the living room and froze. There they were, my brother, Ryan, and Jenna, my ex, caught in an intimate moment that shattered every ounce of trust I had left. They were so absorbed in each other that they didn't even hear me walk in. I couldn't breathe, couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. My body went numb, and for a few moments, I just stood there, watching the betrayal unfold. The rage came next. It surged through me, burning hotter than I could control. I didn't even think, I just reacted, shouting their names, demanding answers. I watched as their faces drained of color, both of them fumbling for words that didn't matter. I screamed, accusing them of everything. The lies, the deceit, the years I had wasted believing in something that was nothing more than a facade. My heart felt like it was being ripped apart with every word I said. Then, my parents rushed in, their expressions tight with discomfort. Before I could even finish what I was saying, they sided with Ryan. They always did. They muttered about how Ryan didn't mean to hurt me, how it wasn't as bad as I was making it out to be. The way they turned their backs on me, the way they whispered to Ryan in hushed tones, made it clear. I was the problem, not him. I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of disbelief and fury. It was as if I was invisible at that moment. My years of loyalty, my pain, none of it mattered. They didn't even try to see it from my side. Jenna, once my confidant, just stood there, avoiding my gaze, her guilt palpable. But my parents? They excused her actions as if it was somehow my fault, like I had somehow pushed them into each other. It was the final blow, the realization that no matter what I did, I would never be enough for them. I couldn't stay there any longer. I turned on my heel and stormed out of the room, my heart pounding, my chest tight with the weight of it all. I didn't care if they tried to stop me. I couldn't be in that house, surrounded by people who didn't care, not anymore. I grabbed my jacket. Didn't even look back as I left the house, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. It was over. Everything was over. Leaving the house that night felt like escaping a burning building, but the flames followed me. My mind raced with every memory of Jenna and me, Every laugh, every promise, every plan we'd made together. It all felt like a sick joke now. I wanted to forget her, forget Ryan, forget the family that had just proved once again how little I mattered to them. But I couldn't escape the betrayal. It clung to me like a second skin, suffocating and inescapable. The breakup wasn't a clean cut. Jenna came to me a week later, feigning remorse, telling me she hadn't meant for things to happen this way. But her words rang hollow, her excuses infuriating. She claimed it wasn't about hurting me. It was about her feelings, about Ryan, about some spark she couldn't deny. I could barely look at her without wanting to scream. She didn't even try to hide her selfishness. She wasn't sorry she'd hurt me. She was sorry I wasn't understanding enough to make it easier for her. The worst part was how my family rallied behind them. Within weeks, Ryan and Jenna were openly dating, and my parents acted like it was some great love story. These things happen, they said, as though their betrayal was an act of fate, not a calculated decision to break me. They insisted I had to let it go, that I should be happy for them. Happy. The word made me sick. They had stolen everything from me, my trust, my relationship, and now my family's loyalty, and still had the audacity to expect my blessing. Every family dinner became unbearable. They would sit together, holding hands like they hadn't destroyed me, while my parents gushed about how meant to be they were. I could barely eat, barely speak. Every time I tried to express my anger, my family shut me down. You can't help who you fall in love with, they said, as if that excused everything. I wasn't just the collateral damage of their so-called love. I was the obstacle they wanted out of the way. The loneliness was crushing. I couldn't go to family events without feeling like an outsider in my own bloodline. I had to watch my parents dote on them, fawning over their happiness, while my pain was dismissed as petty bitterness. They even urged me to make amends, telling me I was being immature for holding on to anger. But how could I forgive them when they'd taken everything from me? How could I move on when every family gathering was a reminder of what I'd lost? It wasn't just Jenna or Ryan anymore, it was all of them. They had chosen sides, and it wasn't mine. I was done trying to prove my worth to people who refused to see it. One night, after yet another dinner filled with backhanded comments and forced smiles, I stood up and walked out without a word. I didn't know if I was walking away for good, but at that moment, I didn't care. I was done letting them tear me apart piece by piece. After cutting ties with my family, I thought I could start rebuilding myself, but the bitterness lingered. Ryan and Jenna's relationship became a grotesque spectacle I couldn't escape, even from a distance. My parents would send passive-aggressive messages, urging me to be the bigger person and accept their love. Friends who still attended family events told me about how Jenna had seamlessly taken my place, charming my family even more than before. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It had infected every part of my life, every memory I thought was mine alone. But the cracks in their perfect facade started to show. Jenna had always been ambitious, almost recklessly so. She loved the high life, expensive dinners, lavish vacations, and designer clothes. When we were together, I'd indulged her when I could, but it was clear that Ryan had taken things a step further. He was paying for her every whim, playing the role of the devoted partner, the one who would give her the world. It didn't take long for those expenses to start catching up to him. I heard whispers about Ryan's financial troubles through mutual acquaintances. He'd maxed out credit cards, dipped into savings, and even taken out loans to keep Jenna happy. It wasn't surprising. Jenna had always been charming, but beneath that charm was a hunger for more money, more luxury, more admiration. Ryan had taken my place, but he'd also inherited the impossible task of keeping up with her demands. I couldn't lie, it felt good to hear about his struggles. For once, Golden Boy Ryan wasn't untouchable. I started paying closer attention, quietly gathering information. Ryan had always been proud of his success, flaunting his promotions and investments. But now, I noticed the subtle changes. He wasn't showing off anymore, wasn't boasting about his latest wins. Instead, he seemed tense, quieter than usual. Jenna, on the other hand, was as radiant as ever, posting pictures of herself in designer outfits, tagging locations I knew Ryan couldn't afford. It was clear she wasn't slowing down. even as his resources dried up. The breaking point came during one of their lavish vacations. A friend of mine who still followed Jenna on social media sent me a screenshot. Jenna had posted a story of herself lounging by a private pool, captioned, "Living my best life." In the background, Ryan was on his laptop, his face strained. The image told me everything I needed to know. Jenna was still taking, and Ryan was struggling to keep up, drowning in the life she demanded. It was poetic, really. The brother who had always been untouchable, the one who'd taken everything from me, was now trapped in a sinking ship of his own making. But I didn't want to just sit back and watch. This wasn't enough. I wanted them to feel the kind of pain I'd felt, the kind that leaves you gutted and raw. So I started planning, carefully, methodically. If Jenna's greed was their weak spot, then that's where I'd strike. The first message from Jenna came late at night. Just a simple, "Hey." I almost deleted it without opening it, but curiosity got the better of me. She was reaching out, testing the waters, trying to gauge if I still harbored enough bitterness or longing to give her an opening. Over the next few weeks, the messages became more frequent. She complained about Ryan's financial struggles, how he couldn't keep up with her lifestyle, how he wasn't the man she thought he was. The audacity was almost laughable. At first, I ignored her. I didn't want to engage, didn't want to let her pull me into whatever game she was playing. But then it hit me. This was my chance. Jenna was desperate, her mask slipping, and if I played my cards right, I could finally get the truth. Not just about her, but about everything. The affair, the lies, her motives. I decided to respond, keeping my messages short and measured, just enough to string her along. I let her think I was still hurt, still vulnerable, still angry enough to want her back. She confessed things I already knew and things I hadn't even imagined. She admitted to the affair, calling it a mistake, but quickly pivoted to blaming Ryan for her unhappiness. She said he was useless, that he didn't have the drive or ambition she thought he did. She painted herself as a victim, trapped in a relationship that wasn't fulfilling her. All the while, she kept hinting at how much she missed what we had, how I had always understood her in ways Ryan never could. I played along, biting back my disgust, keeping my end goal in mind. Ryan's birthday was the perfect stage for my plan. My family, as expected, was throwing him an extravagant party, complete with speeches and toasts to celebrate their golden child. The same house where I'd walked in on their betrayal now served as the backdrop for my revenge. I showed up dressed sharply, my confidence masking the turmoil beneath. The moment I walked in, I could see their unease. Ryan avoided my gaze. Jenna seemed flustered, and my parents were suspiciously cheerful, likely hoping this was the first step toward my healing. When it was my turn to give a toast, I stood up, glass in hand, and smiled. I started off light, joking about sibling rivalries and how Ryan had always been the star of the family. My parents beamed, thinking I was finally falling back into line. I even raised my glass to Jenna, calling her a perfect match for Ryan. The room relaxed, their smug satisfaction palpable. But then I shifted my tone, my voice sharper, the room tightening with the weight of my words. I told them I'd been hesitant to come, considering the history we all shared, but that I had something important to share, something I felt Ryan deserved to know. I pulled out my phone, opened the screenshots, and started reading Jenna's texts aloud. The ones where she begged to come back to me. The ones where she called Ryan a failure. The ones where she admitted she'd been using him from the start. The room fell silent, the only sound Jenna's sharp intake of breath and Ryan's face turning an impossible shade of red. I turned to Jenna, my voice steady but dripping with disdain, and said, "So tell me, Jenna, was this the true love my family insisted I accept, or just another one of your stepping stones?" I turned to Ryan next, locking eyes with him. "You wanted everything I had, didn't you? Well, congratulations, brother. Now you have it, in all its ugly, hollow glory." My parents tried to interject, but I silenced them with a glare, finally unleashing years of frustration. "You chose this. You chose them, and you'll have to live with the mess you defended." I set my glass down, the toast unfinished, and walked out for the last time. I didn't need their approval, their love, or their pity anymore. I was done being a pawn in their twisted games. I walked into the cold night air, free at last, leaving their chaos behind me for good. That night, I sat in my apartment with a quiet satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. The tension I'd carried for so long had finally released. For the first time, I'd stood up for myself, not just to Jenna and Ryan, but to my entire family. I poured myself a drink, letting the silence of my space settle around me, free from the noise of their betrayal. But the peace didn't last long. Around midnight, I heard a loud banging on my door. When I opened it, there she was, Jenna. She was swaying on unsteady feet, her makeup smudged, her eyes glassy from too much alcohol. She reeked of wine and bad decisions, clutching her purse like it was the only thing holding her together. Before I could say anything, she stumbled inside, slurring my name, her voice dripping with venom. She started ranting immediately, her words tumbling over each other in a drunken, incoherent mess. She blamed me for everything, her humiliation, Ryan's anger, the cracks forming in the perfect little life she had built for herself. "You ruined me," she slurred, her voice rising as she stumbled around my apartment, gesturing wildly. She accused me of being petty, of not being able to move on, of dragging her through the mud in front of everyone. She painted herself as the victim yet again, completely blind to the destruction she had left in her wake. Her words were as sharp as they were desperate, but they couldn't cut me anymore. I stayed calm, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. Her rant escalated, her voice growing louder, more erratic, as she knocked over a glass on my coffee table. When she started moving closer, pointing her finger at me like I was the villain in her tragic story, I knew I'd had enough. I stepped back, picked up my phone, and called the police. She didn't even notice at first, too lost in her drunken tirade to see what was happening. When I hung up and told her the police were on their way, her demeanor shifted, fear flashing across her face for the briefest moment. She tried to argue, to plead with me, but I stood firm. "You need to leave," I said, my voice cold and final. When the police arrived, they found her sitting on my couch, head in her hands, still muttering incoherently. I explained the situation, and they escorted her out. She turned back once, her eyes glassy and filled with something I couldn't decipher, regret, anger, maybe both. But I didn't care anymore. That was the last time I ever saw her. After they left, I stood in the silence of my apartment, feeling a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. She was gone, truly gone, and with her, the last threads of a life I no longer wanted to be a part of. That night, I made a promise to myself. No more looking back. No more letting people like Jenna or Ryan or even my family dictate my worth. I locked the door behind me and walked into the next chapter of my life, leaving their chaos behind forever.
My husband locked himself in his streaming room during a family emergency, so I exposed him. When I first met my husband, he was charming, funny, and had this boyish energy that made everything feel light and exciting. He had big dreams, he wanted to make it as a streamer, turning his love of gaming into a career. At the time, I thought it was cute. He talked about how he'd create a space where people could hang out and laugh, and I thought, why not? Everyone deserves to follow their dreams. When we got married, it felt like we were a team. I worked a stable job while he spent his free time gaming. Back then, it was harmless. He played in the evenings, but he'd always make time for me. We'd watch movies, cook together, and talk about the future. I told myself it was just a hobby, and once we had kids, he'd step up. The first cracks started showing when I got pregnant with our daughter. His gaming sessions got longer. He began streaming late at night, saying it was the prime time to grow his audience. I'd wake up at 2 a.m. to use the bathroom and hear him laughing with his chat. I asked him if he could cut back, but he always had an excuse. "I'm building something here," he'd say. "This is for us." When our daughter was born, I assumed he'd shift gears. I was wrong. He started spending more money on his setup, fancier microphones, better lighting, soundproofing panels. He said it was an investment in his career. Meanwhile, I was the one waking up for 3 a.m. feedings and learning how to function on 2 hours of sleep. He'd lock himself in his streaming room, telling me he couldn't be interrupted during a stream. By the time our son was born 3 years later, his hobby had turned into a full-blown obsession. He quit his part-time job to focus on streaming, even though he wasn't making any real money from it. I was left to cover all the bills while juggling 2 kids and a demanding job. Every time I brought it up, he'd say, "This is temporary. Once I blow up, everything will change." I made excuses for him for years. To my friends and family, I painted a picture of him as a loving, supportive dad who just happened to have a passion for gaming. Deep down, I knew the truth, but admitting it felt like admitting I'd made a mistake. I didn't want to be the woman who chose the wrong person to build a life with. Things came to a head last week. It was a Thursday, and I came home from work exhausted. I'd been in meetings all day, and all I wanted was to collapse on the couch. As soon as I walked in, I knew something was wrong. Our 5-year-old daughter was playing quietly in the living room, but our 2-year-old son was nowhere in sight. I called out to my husband, but there was no answer. I found our son lying in his crib, his face flushed and his breathing labored. When I touched his forehead, it was burning hot. Panic set in. I yelled for my husband again, but I already knew where he was. I marched to the streaming room and, sure enough, the door was locked. This wasn't new. The lock was his way of ensuring he wouldn't be bothered during streams. I knocked hard and shouted that our son was sick. His reply came muffled through the door, "I can't pause right now. I'm live." I couldn't believe it. Our child was sick, and he was more concerned about entertaining strangers online. I grabbed the spare key from the kitchen drawer and unlocked the door. He was sitting in his chair, wearing his headset, grinning at the screen. The moment I stepped inside, his smile vanished, but I didn't care. I pointed to the crib monitor I was holding. "Our son has a fever, and you're in here playing games." The chat on his screen exploded with messages. They'd heard everything. Some people were asking if everything was okay. Others were laughing, treating it like some kind of soap opera. He looked mortified. "You're embarrassing me," he said, as if I was the problem. I didn't care. I told him to get off the stream and help me, but he just sat there, frozen. I stormed out and took both kids to the ER by myself. Our daughter kept asking why Daddy wasn't coming with us, and I didn't have the heart to explain. At the hospital, the doctor said our son had an ear infection and a high fever, but we'd caught it in time. I texted my husband the update. His reply? "That's good. I'll check on him later." The next day, he was furious. He said I'd ruined his stream and embarrassed him in front of his audience. He didn't apologize for ignoring me, for locking himself away, or for leaving me to handle everything alone. Instead, he acted like he was the victim. "Do you know how hard I've been working to grow my channel?" he yelled. I couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. This wasn't an isolated incident. There was the time I asked him to watch the kids so I could grocery shop in peace. I came home to find our daughter coloring on the walls and our son chewing on a power cord. He'd been streaming the whole time, completely oblivious. When I confronted him, he said, "They were fine. You're overreacting." Another time, he let our daughter stay up until midnight because he forgot it was a school night. She was cranky and exhausted the next day, but he didn't think it was a big deal. "She's a kid," he said. "She'll bounce back." I'd been hiding his behavior from my family for years. I didn't want to deal with the "I told you so" comments or the judgment. But after the ER incident, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. At a family dinner that weekend, his mom asked how things were going. Normally, I'd plaster on a smile and say everything was fine. This time, I didn't. I told them everything. The locked doors. The neglect. The excuses. His mom looked horrified. His sister, who has kids of her own, was furious. She asked him point blank, "What is wrong with you?" He tried to brush it off, saying I was exaggerating, but no one was buying it. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone. He's still mad at me for airing our dirty laundry, but I don't care. I've spent years protecting his image while he sat in his streaming room, acting like a child. I'm done making excuses. If he wants to be mad, let him be mad. I have 2 kids to take care of, and they deserve better than a dad who locks himself away when they need him. I'm not sure what the future holds, but I know one thing: I'm done carrying this burden alone. If he wants to change, it's on him. But honestly, I'm not holding my breath. Update. The weeks after I exposed my husband for neglecting our kids were nothing short of chaotic. The tension in the house was unbearable. Every conversation between us turned into an argument. He still wouldn't admit he had done anything wrong. Instead, he doubled down on blaming me for ruining his career. According to him, it wasn't his neglect of our children that caused the fallout, it was my decision to confront him in front of his stream audience. I had made it clear that things had to change. I told him he would need to step up as a parent, and since I was the one working full-time, he would have to handle the kids during the day. He didn't argue, but he didn't exactly agree either. He was too focused on trying to salvage his online reputation. I'd hear him in his streaming room at all hours, ranting about how he'd been falsely accused and trying to laugh off the chat's constant trolling. His audience had not been kind. Clips of me barging into his streaming room with the spare key had gone viral on multiple platforms. People were mocking him, calling him Deadbeat Dad Live and Locked Door Gamer. Some even started coming into his chat just to spam questions about his parenting. Instead of addressing it maturely or taking accountability, he resorted to banning people and lashing out, which only made things worse. At home, he was useless. Our daughter would ask him to play with her, and he'd brush her off with a distracted, maybe later. When our son cried, he'd sit there and yell for me to deal with it, even though I was the one juggling work and household responsibilities. I started to realize that, despite all the drama, nothing had actually changed. He was still locked in his room, avoiding reality. I confided in my mom about what was going on. She had always been hesitant about our relationship, but she never said, "I told you so." Instead, she listened. When I told her I was considering leaving him, she asked me one question: "Is this the life you want for your kids?" That question stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What kind of example was I setting for my children by staying with someone who refused to grow up? I decided to give him an ultimatum. One evening, after the kids were in bed, I sat him down and told him how I felt. I told him he had two choices: get a real job and join me in couples therapy, or we would get a divorce. He laughed. "You're not serious," he said. "You wouldn't do that to the kids." I told him I was absolutely serious, but he didn't take me seriously. He accused me of being dramatic, of overreacting, and even of trying to sabotage his dreams. He called me controlling and said I was trying to emasculate him by asking him to get a job. "What kind of wife doesn't support her husband's passion?" he said. That was his go-to excuse for everything, his passion. At that moment, I knew he wasn't going to change. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I didn't tell him right away. I wanted to make sure I had all my ducks in a row before I dropped the news. I started documenting everything: his streaming hours, his neglect of the kids, the texts he sent me blaming me for his online downfall. I needed evidence, just in case the divorce got messy. And it got messy. When I finally told him I had filed for divorce, he flipped out. He called me every name in the book, accused me of trying to destroy his life, and said I was brainwashing our kids against him. He refused to leave the house, claiming he had just as much right to be there as I did. I ended up staying with my mom for a few weeks while the legal process played out. His behavior during the divorce was nothing short of ridiculous. He told the court he was a stay-at-home dad who had been unfairly forced out of his family. He even tried to argue that his streaming was a legitimate job, despite the fact that he had never made more than a few dollars here and there from donations. My lawyer was prepared. We had records showing his total lack of involvement with the kids, as well as proof of his neglect. In the end, the court sided with me. I was granted full custody of the kids, and he was given limited visitation. He didn't take it well. He went on another one of his streams and ranted about how the system was rigged against dads, and how I had manipulated the courts. Once the divorce was finalized, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells in my own home. The kids adjusted surprisingly well. They started to thrive without the constant tension in the house. I moved into a smaller house closer to my job and my mom's place. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. I decorated the kids' rooms with their favorite characters, and we started new routines: movie nights, trips to the park, and Sunday breakfasts at grandma's. The kids seemed happier, and so was I. As for my ex, he's still streaming, though his audience has dwindled to almost nothing. He occasionally sends me bitter texts, blaming me for his fall from grace. I ignore them. I'm too busy building a life where my kids feel loved and safe. Looking back, I can't believe how long I put up with his behavior. I think I was afraid of failing, of admitting that I had made a mistake. But leaving him wasn't failing. It was the best decision I could have made for myself and my kids. Now, when I think about the life I want for my children, I feel hopeful. They deserve to grow up in a home filled with love and respect, not one overshadowed by neglect and excuses. And as for me? I deserve that too. Married to a liar: how I uncovered my husband's secret family. I met Ryan when I was 24, fresh out of college and brimming with ambition. He was charming in a way that felt old-fashioned, opening doors, pulling out chairs, always attentive. It was hard not to be swept up in his quiet confidence and the way he made me feel like I was the center of his world. Within a year, we were married in a modest ceremony surrounded by friends and family. It felt like the beginning of a perfect story. From the start, our life together was marked by a sense of unity. We shared dreams of building a future, buying a house, and starting a family. But as the years passed, the last part began to weigh on me. Month after month, then year after year, we tried to have children. Doctors assured us that nothing was wrong, yet every negative test felt like a tiny fracture in our otherwise solid foundation. Ryan always comforted me, telling me we had time, but his reassurances started to feel hollow. Ryan's job as a project manager required frequent travel. At first, I didn't mind. He'd bring back small souvenirs, photos of places he'd been, and stories of the people he worked with. But over time, the trips grew longer, more frequent, and less detailed in his retellings. He stopped bringing back mementos. Instead, he'd return home exhausted, his phone glued to his hand, claiming work had been especially stressful. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. The first cracks in my trust appeared during a routine moment. I had borrowed his laptop to look up a recipe, and a notification popped up for an email from a woman named Claire. The subject line was mundane, something about schedules, but the familiarity of her name in his inbox unsettled me. When I asked him later who Claire was, he laughed it off, saying she was just a colleague helping with logistics on a project. His answer felt rehearsed. Doubts began to creep in, uninvited but persistent. Ryan's phone was always locked, his password suddenly changed. He started taking calls in the garage or stepping outside when his phone buzzed. On nights when he was home, he seemed distracted, scrolling endlessly or typing out messages with a furrowed brow. When I asked if everything was okay, he would sigh heavily and tell me work was just a lot right now. I wanted to trust him, but trust began to feel like a luxury I couldn't afford. The turning point came when Ryan's trips started to follow a pattern. Every other month, he'd have a week-long assignment in a city 3 hours away. At first, I thought nothing of it, consulting jobs can be unpredictable. But when I mentioned visiting him during one of these trips, his reaction was immediate. He stammered, saying the schedule was packed and the hotel was uncomfortable. It was the first time I saw panic flicker across his face. It planted a seed of suspicion. I began to piece things together in the quiet hours of the night when my thoughts spiraled. His erratic behavior, the locked phone, the increasing distance between us. I started combing through our joint bank statements, noting expenses I didn't recognize. There were charges for restaurants I'd never been to, gifts I'd never received, and hotel stays that didn't match his work itinerary. Each discovery felt like a dagger twisting in my chest. Still, I told myself there had to be an explanation. One afternoon, I decided to confront my fears head-on. I called his office, claiming it was urgent, only to be told Ryan was off that week. My blood ran cold. He had told me he was in a neighboring state for a critical client meeting. I hung up, my hands trembling, and stared at the phone. If he wasn't where he said he was, then where was he? And more importantly, who was he with? My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer. I decided to follow him during his next work trip. I made up an excuse about visiting my sister and left the morning he did, trailing his car at a safe distance. The drive felt endless, my heart pounding with every mile. When he finally pulled into a quiet suburban neighborhood, I parked a few houses away and watched as he walked up to a charming 2-story home. A woman opened the door, smiling, and 2 children ran out to greet him. I sat there, frozen, as the pieces of my life fell apart in front of me. Ryan, my husband, my partner, my confidant, had a second family. He scooped up the children, laughing, and kissed the woman on the cheek before they all disappeared inside. The image was surreal, like watching a scene from someone else's life. My hands gripped the steering wheel as tears blurred my vision. Every moment of our marriage felt like a cruel joke, a facade hiding this secret life. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with uncovering the truth. I combed through his social media, finding nothing, and then turned to hers. Claire. Her profile was public, filled with pictures of Ryan, or Mark, as she called him. They had been together for 7 years. The children were his, their birthdays overlapping with the years we had been trying to conceive. My stomach churned as I realized the depth of his betrayal. He had built 2 lives, and I was the unwitting outsider in both. But as I dug deeper, an even more unsettling truth began to emerge. Claire's post stretched back further than I anticipated, capturing milestones that predated my marriage to Ryan. Anniversary celebrations, holidays spent together, even the birth of their first child, all of it existed in a timeline that overlapped with the very beginning of my relationship with him. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. I wasn't the betrayed wife. I was the other woman. Every memory I had of our life together warped under the weight of this discovery. Ryan's elaborate lies, the frequent trips, the lack of connection to my family and friends, it all made sense now. I was the secret, the interloper in a marriage that had existed long before I met him. I thought back to the early days of our relationship, the vague answers about his past, the rushed timeline of our engagement. He hadn't built 2 lives. He had only extended the one he already had. I couldn't stomach the thought of confronting him just yet. I needed to process the enormity of what I'd uncovered. How could I have been so blind? So willing to ignore the warning signs? I scoured every piece of evidence again, hoping to find some contradiction, some detail that would prove I was wrong. But the truth was undeniable. Ryan had used me to fill a void in his life, to escape the responsibilities of his real family. And I had let him. The hardest part was deciding what to do next. Exposing him to Claire felt like the right thing to do, but it also meant destroying the lives of 2 innocent children. Walking away without a word felt cowardly, but what did I owe to a man who had built our relationship on lies? I stared at my phone, the screenshots and photos stored in a folder marked Truth, debating whether to send them to her. My anger screamed for justice, but my heart ached for the family he would leave shattered in the aftermath. I decided I wouldn't let him walk away unscathed. I couldn't fix the damage he'd done to my life, but I could make sure he faced the consequences of his deceit. I began with small steps. I compiled every bit of evidence I had, photos, bank statements, messages, and Claire's posts, and made copies. I wanted to ensure I had proof no matter what he tried to deny. Then, I reached out to a lawyer, seeking advice on how to protect myself legally. With the lawyer's guidance, I drafted a letter to Claire. It wasn't cruel or vindictive, it was factual. I included dates, timelines, and evidence, carefully explaining my side of the story. I apologized for the pain the truth would cause but emphasized that she deserved to know the man she called her husband was living a double life. Before sending it, I hesitated, questioning if I was doing the right thing. But the thought of her living in the dark, as I had, solidified my resolve. The next step was personal. I confronted Ryan one evening when he returned from one of his trips. My heart pounded as I laid the evidence out on the table, piece by piece. His face shifted from confusion to shock to anger, but I stayed calm. He tried to deny it at first, spinning lies faster than I could refute them. But the weight of the proof was undeniable. When he realized he couldn't talk his way out of it, he shifted to pleading, begging me not to ruin his life. I let him plead. I let him panic. Ryan's desperation was almost pitiful. He swore it was all a mistake, that he had meant to leave Claire but couldn't because of the children. He painted himself as a man trapped by circumstance, as though I should feel sorry for him. I sat silently, letting him ramble, watching him squirm as he tried to manipulate me one last time. His words, once soothing and persuasive, now felt like poison dripping into an already contaminated well. He didn't know I had already sent the letter to Claire. The letter had been mailed earlier that day, certified with a signature required. I wanted to make sure she received it, that she would see the undeniable truth and know she wasn't alone in her betrayal. I imagined her opening the envelope, the carefully written words spilling into her lap, her eyes scanning the evidence that shattered her world. I didn't do it to hurt her. I did it because she deserved to know the kind of man she was married to. As Ryan continued to beg, I finally spoke. I told him that I knew everything, about Claire, the children, the lies that had spanned nearly a decade. I told him I wasn't going to keep his secret anymore. His face went pale, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He asked what I wanted, as if this could be fixed with a bargain. I told him I didn't want anything from him anymore. I only wanted the truth to come to light. In the days that followed, I began to dismantle the life we had built together. I canceled the joint accounts, packed his belongings, and changed the locks on the house. Every step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that he had taken. I left a box of his things on the porch with a note that said simply, "You know where to go." I imagined him dragging the box to his car, knowing he had lost everything. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, but closure. Claire reached out to me not long after she received the letter. Her voice trembled as she thanked me for telling her the truth, though I could hear the pain beneath her gratitude. She told me that Ryan, or Mark, as she still called him, had confessed everything after she confronted him. He had tried to spin it, of course, claiming he had been planning to leave me, that I had misunderstood the situation. But the evidence was too damning, and she wasn't as easily deceived as she once had been. Our conversation was brief but poignant. There was no animosity between us, only a shared grief for the lives we thought we had. Claire said she didn't know what her next steps would be, but she thanked me again for giving her the chance to make an informed decision. I wished her well and hung up, feeling an odd sense of solidarity with a woman I had never met. We had both been victims of the same man's selfishness, and now, we were free. Ryan tried to contact me a few times after that, sending long, apologetic emails and leaving voicemails that swung between anger and desperation. I didn't respond. I had nothing left to say to him. I filed for divorce, the paperwork meticulous and unyielding. My lawyer ensured there were no loopholes for him to exploit. I didn't want revenge in the legal sense. I just wanted to sever every tie that bound me to him, to walk away without looking back. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild my life. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of what had happened felt unbearable. But slowly, I started to find pieces of myself that I thought had been lost forever. I reconnected with friends, pursued hobbies I had neglected, and started therapy to untangle the web of emotions left in Ryan's wake. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself, not for someone else's expectations or lies. Ryan's life, from what little I heard through mutual acquaintances, fell apart. Claire left him, taking the kids and moving to another state. His job, once his refuge, became a source of scrutiny as whispers of his double life spread. He had built his world on lies, and without them, it crumbled. I didn't revel in his downfall, but I didn't mourn it either. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. I, on the other hand, was finally free to live with mine. Looking back, I don't regret uncovering the truth, painful as it was. It allowed me to reclaim my life and my sense of self. It taught me to trust my instincts and to value honesty above all else. Ryan had taken years from me, but he hadn't taken my future. That was mine to rebuild, piece by piece, stronger and more resilient than before. The truth may have broken me, but it also set me free, and for that, I am grateful. I told my friend about what her fiancé drunkenly said to me, and I might have ruined the wedding. I, 29F, have been best friends with Emma, 29F, since we were kids. We've been through everything together: school, breakups, job changes, you name it. We've always had that kind of friendship where we could tell each other anything, and even if we fought, we knew we'd always make up. Emma's like a sister to me, and I always assumed I'd be a part of her life forever, including standing beside her as her maid of honor at her wedding. Emma's fiancé, Ryan, 35M, entered the picture about 2 years ago. He's charming, funny, and they seem like a good match. At first, I was happy for her. But over time, something about Ryan didn't sit right with me. It wasn't anything huge, just little things, like how he'd occasionally be too flirty when Emma wasn't around, or how he'd make comments about how alike Emma and I looked. We do resemble each other a bit, with similar hair color and build, but it always felt weird to me when he'd bring it up. The night everything changed, Emma had a big party to celebrate her engagement. There was a lot of drinking, dancing, and overall excitement. I had a few drinks myself but was pacing things so I wouldn't get too tipsy. Ryan, on the other hand, had been drinking pretty heavily. At one point, when Emma had stepped out to talk to some other friends, Ryan and I found ourselves alone on the patio. That's when he leaned in close and whispered something that made my stomach drop. "I always thought you were cute, you know? We could sneak somewhere else if you want." I was stunned. I didn't know what to say, so I just kind of laughed it off awkwardly, figuring he was just drunk and confused. It was uncomfortable, but part of me thought maybe he was just drunk and mistaking me for Emma. After all, people mix us up all the time, especially when alcohol is involved. But there was something about the way he said it that didn't sit right with me. It felt intentional, like he wasn't just confusing me for her. I spent the next few days agonizing over whether to tell Emma. I mean, Ryan was drunk, and people say stupid things when they're drunk, right? But what if this wasn't just a mistake? What if Ryan had been harboring these thoughts all along? The last thing I wanted was to ruin her engagement, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that keeping this from her would be wrong. So, I made the decision to tell her. When I brought it up, I tried to be as gentle as possible. I told her what had happened, explained that Ryan had been drinking a lot, and said that while I wasn't sure what his intentions were, I thought she should know. Emma didn't take it well. At first, she didn't say much, just kind of nodded, but I could tell she was upset. I reassured her that I wasn't trying to accuse Ryan of anything, just that I wanted to be honest with her. But the next day, I got a very different reaction. Emma called me furious. She accused me of trying to sabotage her engagement, saying I was jealous of her relationship with Ryan. She brought up things from our past that I thought had long been resolved, like how I'd gotten into a relationship before she did back in high school and how she felt like I always had to be the center of attention. I was completely blindsided. She told me that I was no longer her maid of honor and that she didn't even know if she wanted me at the wedding at all. Hearing that from Emma, the person I thought would always have my back, was gut-wrenching. I tried to explain that I wasn't jealous, that I was just trying to look out for her, but she wouldn't hear it. She said I'd crossed a line and accused me of making things up to stir drama. Now, I'm left feeling completely lost. I didn't think I did anything wrong by telling her the truth, but now I'm questioning everything. Did I overreact to what Ryan said? Was I wrong to tell her? Maybe I misread the situation, but I didn't want to keep it from her and risk something worse happening down the line. On the other hand, Emma's reaction has me wondering if I should have just let it go, chalked it up to Ryan being drunk, and moved on. I feel like I'm losing my best friend over something that wasn't even my fault, and I don't know if there's any coming back from this. Update. After I posted the original story, I wasn't sure if Emma would ever talk to me again. She hadn't spoken to me for a week after she dropped me as her maid of honor, and I didn't want to push things further. But then, she reached out and asked if we could meet up to talk. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I hoped it meant she had cooled down and was ready to listen. We met at a coffee shop, and right away, I could tell something had shifted. Emma looked exhausted, like she hadn't been sleeping well. She started by apologizing for how she reacted when I told her about Ryan. She said that hearing what I told her triggered a lot of old insecurities she had about our friendship, insecurities that she had never really dealt with. She admitted that she'd always felt a little overshadowed by me, even though she knew I never intentionally made her feel that way. It was hard for her to see past those feelings when I told her about Ryan, which is why she lashed out the way she did. Then, she told me something that I didn't expect. After we talked, she confronted Ryan about what I'd told her, and at first, he denied it. But later, when she pressed him, he admitted that he did say what I claimed, though he insisted he was just drunk and didn't mean it seriously. Emma told me she wasn't sure if she believed him. She said she had been noticing small things that made her question their relationship even before I told her about the comment, and now she wasn't sure what to think. We talked for a long time that day, not just about Ryan, but about our friendship. Emma confessed that she had always been afraid I'd outshine her, and when this situation came up, it hit a nerve she didn't even realize was still there. I admitted that I hadn't always noticed how she felt, but now I could see how some of my actions might have unintentionally hurt her in the past. We both cried a little, and it felt like a lot of old wounds were finally being aired out. In the end, Emma decided to call off the wedding, at least for now. She said she needed time to figure out how she felt about Ryan, but more importantly, she needed to work on herself and her insecurities. We're still working on rebuilding our friendship, but I think we're on the right track. As for Ryan, I haven't heard from him, and I don't expect to. I'm sad that things ended this way, but I'm also relieved that Emma and I were able to talk through everything. In a strange way, I think this whole situation, as painful as it was, might have saved both of us from future heartache. I don't know what will happen with Emma and Ryan, but I'm hopeful that whatever comes next, she'll make the right choice for herself. So, no wedding for now, but at least I haven't lost my best friend. And maybe, in the end, that's what matters most. I was mistreated by my family growing up, so when they asked to reconcile to keep up appearances, I exposed them and ruined their reputation. I grew up in a family that thrived on appearances. To the outside world, we were the picture of harmony. But inside our house, things were different. My mother had a talent for weaponizing love. One moment, she'd hug me so tightly I thought she might mean it, and the next, she'd remind me that I'd never be as smart or as graceful as my older sister, Amanda. My father was more subtle. He believed in silent punishments, the cold shoulder, dinners eaten in utter silence if I failed to meet his impossible standards. Once, I came home with an art award I was proud of. Instead of congratulating me, he told me it wasn't worth as much as Amanda's academic trophies. The worst was Amanda, though. She excelled in everything my parents valued. And she made sure I knew it. She'd borrow my clothes without asking, then blame me if something got ruined. When I got upset, my mother would tell me to stop being petty, that I should be grateful Amanda even wanted to borrow my things. When I turned 18, my parents decided I needed to contribute to the household. Not with chores, those I'd been doing for years, but financially. They demanded I hand over half my paycheck from my part-time job. Amanda, who still didn't lift a finger around the house, was exempt from this rule. One Christmas, I saved up for months to buy everyone thoughtful gifts. When I handed my mother her present, she smiled and said, "This isn't really my style," before tossing it aside. My father didn't even open his. And Amanda laughed when she saw what I got her, saying she'd seen it on sale and figured I'd gotten it cheap. I moved out at 22, scraping together everything I had to afford a tiny apartment. My family barely acknowledged my departure. When I called my mother a few weeks later, she said she'd been too busy to notice I was gone. That was the moment I realized I was nothing more than an afterthought to them. The final straw came a year later. Amanda announced her engagement and asked if I'd help her with the wedding. I agreed, thinking maybe this was a chance to mend things. Instead, I found out she'd used my credit card to pay for her wedding dress without asking. When I confronted her, my parents took her side, calling me selfish for making a scene. I went no contact after that. I changed my number, moved to a new city, and deleted my social media. For the first time in my life, I felt free. No more walking on eggshells, no more biting my tongue to keep the peace. I threw myself into my work, discovering a knack for a niche industry that blended creativity and problem solving. Over time, I built a successful career, earning respect and recognition for my expertise. My life became a reflection of my efforts, free from the shadow of my family's impossible expectations, and I finally felt like I belonged in the world I had created for myself. Years passed. Then, out of nowhere, an email from my mother appeared in my inbox. She wrote about how much they missed me, how the family wasn't the same without me. Suspicious, I ignored it. But then my father emailed too, followed by Amanda. The tone was desperate, almost pleading. Curiosity got the better of me. I replied, asking why they were so eager to reconnect after all these years. They wanted to meet, to explain everything in person. Against my better judgment, I agreed. A part of me still longed for the family I'd always wished they could be. When I arrived at the family home, the atmosphere felt tense but overly rehearsed. My mother greeted me with a warm hug that didn't feel genuine, and my father offered a handshake, something he'd never done before. Amanda, however, seemed annoyed rather than happy to see me. It wasn't long before the truth slipped out. They needed me to play nice and be the perfect family member to secure a lucrative business deal that would benefit Amanda's husband. I was stunned. I confronted them, asking if this was the real reason for their sudden interest in reconciling. My mother tried to downplay it, saying it was a mutual opportunity for the family. My father stayed silent, as always, but Amanda exploded. She accused me of being petty, selfish, and jealous of her success. The argument escalated quickly, with years of resentment spilling out on both sides. Then an idea struck me. Instead of storming out, I decided to play along. I agreed to help them, masking my fury with a polite smile. They seemed relieved, almost giddy, and wasted no time inviting me to a family gathering where I'd meet the wealthy couple tied to the business deal. At the gathering, the couple, a polished, older pair with an air of self-importance, asked me how long I'd known Amanda's husband. I smiled and said, "Honestly, I've only met him a couple of times. I actually don't know much about him at all." Their expressions faltered, but I didn't stop there. When they asked about family traditions, vacations, and dinners, I revealed the truth. I casually mentioned how I hadn't spoken to my family in years, how they'd treated me as less than my entire life, and how this sudden reunion felt more like a favor for them than genuine reconciliation. By the time I finished, the couple's smiles had disappeared entirely. Amanda's face turned red with rage. She dragged me aside and accused me of ruining everything. She called me jealous and petty, screaming that I'd always been bitter about her success. When I refused to apologize, she lunged at me, trying to slap me. My father and mother intervened, pulling her away, but it was clear the damage was done. I left the gathering with my head held high. Letting the truth slip out in front of their precious business connection was the perfect revenge. They'd shown me exactly what they valued, and it wasn't me. Walking away this time felt liberating, not painful. The door was closed for good, and I was finally at peace. Weeks later, I received an email from the wealthy couple. Curious, I agreed to meet them for coffee. They were polite but direct, explaining that my family had initially mentioned I was experienced in a niche industry they were looking to enter. But it wasn't just about business. Over the course of the conversation, they revealed something unexpected. They'd both been in similar situations with their own families. They shared how they'd endured years of mistreatment before cutting ties and building the life they wanted. Their shared experiences made them value family deeply, but only the family they'd created together. They explained that this was why they sought authenticity in their personal and professional relationships. They admired my honesty during the gathering, even if it had derailed the original business proposal. By the end of the meeting, they surprised me with a job offer. They were impressed by my knowledge and wanted someone they could trust. I left the coffee shop stunned but hopeful. For once, speaking my truth hadn't just set me free, it had opened a door I never expected. I wasn't sure if I'd take the job, but knowing I had the option felt like victory enough.